Hey, in this lecture, we're going to take a look at blade views and how you can pass in variables and display them on the page. So for example here, this is the context view blade page. So what we're going to do is that we're going to remove this and we're going to call that view context. Okay, we're going to update the text just to make sure it's working. Context page, update it for example. Now we're going to go to our page and refresh, and here it is. So how do we actually pass in parameters into this view and then use them with blade? To pass in some variable value into the view, we're going to add it here as an array, and we're going to call it apples for example. That's the name of the variable, and then red is the value for example. So here we're going to copy the name of the value, we're going to add it here with double curly braces, and here this is the beauty of blade, that anything that is inside the curly braces, the double curly braces, is going to be executed as a PHP code. So inside here you can pass in names of variables, or you can even pass in some PHP code, and it should be able to execute it. Also, it gives you a security feature because this is escaping the special HTML characters, so you can avoid XSS attacks. So it's a good practice to use it with blade, and let's see if it works. We're gonna come here, we're gonna refresh, and it says context page updated red. So that's basically a small intro on how to use blade variables and the blade templates inside a blade view. And now let's cover how to create a form and pass in data to the backend, and how the backend would be receiving that data on a controller. And then for the next lecture, we're going to store all that data on a database table. Continuing on the next part of the lecture, what we're going to do now is that we're going to create a very simple form, and then we're going to receive all that data on the backend, and then we're going to validate for the data. So we're gonna keep things very simple so that everybody can understand. And first of all, we're going to start by erasing this. We're just gonna have a simple view called context. Here we have the context page, and all we're going to do is that we're going to add a couple of inputs and a form into this page so that the user can enter some data and send it to the backend, and then the controller is going to receive that data and it's going to validate if it's correct data or not correct data. Okay, so for this tutorial, as we said, we're gonna keep things very simple. So we're gonna start by putting a form tag and closing it so that we can input our things, and we're only going to be sending 2 attributes so that we keep it very simple. And let's just add a label here and put something like contact name, and then let's create an input. We're gonna put a type text and name. Let's call it contact name. Okay, now we're going to do the same one, but let's call it contact age for example, and here we're going to be putting contact age. Okay, now that we have this, we can change the type to number, that's fine, but we're going to try and do the validations on the back end. That's the whole point. We want the Laravel to take care of the validations. So this simple form, let's just refresh it and see if it updated. Okay, so here we have a contact name and a contact age. Don't worry about the page looking ugly right now. We're not doing any CSS or anything like that. We just want to make it so that we understand the concepts of Laravel. That we have our form, we're going to add an action to our form that is going to point to a URL in our application. So remember, here we can execute PHP code, so we're just going to do URL, and then here we're going to do something like add contact. for example. And here we're also going to be, one thing I forgot was a double quotes. And here one thing we're going to be adding is the method, and our method is going to be post. Okay, now we're going to copy the URL. We're going to go into our router. We're going to create a post router because this is a post call. Add contact, and then here in here we're going to be calling the context controller. So you remember the syntax, right? We did something like, let me erase this. We have to pass in an array that says the name of our controller, which is going to be the context controller, and then we're going to create a function called add contact. So now we're going to go into our context controller. So we're going to create a function here called add contact, and in here we're going to accept the request object so that we can get all the data that is being sent to us from the front end. And here we can see that we have it included, so we can use it. So how would we obtain our attribute? So the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to copy this. We're going to create a variable just like that, and then we're going to call it with the request dash and then the name of the attribute. And then we're going to do the same thing for the context age. Okay, very simple so far, very straightforward. We have a view with the form, and we only have two inputs, this one and this one, that we can see here in our ugly page. And then we're going to go and get the values in our controller when we hit this URL. And this URL is gonna be hit when the form action is submitted. We still need to add the submit button, which is something we're gonna do now. To create our submit button, we're going to create a new input. We are going to add a type equals to submit, and we're going to add a value, something like add contact. And then we're just gonna close this input. So now that we have our submit button, let's go into the page and submit something, anything, and click add context. As you can see, it says page expired. The reason why it says this is because Laravel has a CRF token protection that we need to add so that the form works. So the way to do that is that we're going to come here and we're going to add a CSRF, because this is something that all calls in Laravel need, and it's a protection. So we add it, and now we go back to our page, we refresh, put in something, add contact, and as you can see, it now does go to the add contact URL, which in fact is going to come here, which in fact is going to go into our controller, which in fact is going to come here, and then it's going to basically show, we can do something like return, say, contact name, just to make sure things are working, and see what happens. So let's do that. Okay, and as you can see, it's returning me the contact name. So it's that simple. It really is that simple. Now we're going to go into validating all these. So say for example, on the contact age, you can only send numbers. You cannot send strings or anything like that. And for example, if you only accept ages from 15 to 60, how can you limit that? And all that validation is what we're going to be exploring next. Okay, now we're going to validate the data, and it's very easy. So we want to validate the data before we assign it to anything. So we're going to do something like validated equals to, we're going to call the request, and then we're going to call its function validate, and then we're going to pass in an array like this. And here we are going to be calling our name, so it'll be contact name, and then the first validation rule that we want to put it would be the required rule. Then, because we must require that attribute when the user is, for example, here typing in the name, it must be required, otherwise it should give an error. So now we're going to do a required. We're also going to make it, for example, a maximum of 250 characters, for example, as in the user can type in a super long name, for example. Now we're going to go into the second attribute, which is basically the contact age, and here we're going to make it also required, and at the same time we're going to make it numeric, so that we are sure that the user is inputting a number. For example, we are going to return any message, just something so that we know that these validations passed correctly. Normally in here you would return like a redirect to some other page or some other view, but on this tutorial we just want to keep it simple. So now let's validate if the contact name has been inputted and the contact age is a numeric value. So how do we do that? We're going to come here, we're going to refresh our page, and here we're going to be adding something like name, and here on the context page we're going to leave it blank. We're not going to add anything, right? So we're going to go add contact, and as you can see here, the request, the post is saying 302 found, meaning that it's not validating or it's not advancing. It's not really the proper error message right now, but that doesn't matter. All we know is that it's not working because here we did not input a valid number. Why? Because here the numeric is required. So now I'm gonna add something like name and then 23, and as you can see now it did process correctly. It sent me a 200 OK status, and now we did get our message. So this is very basic level of how you can validate your data and how you can return success or anything that you want to return after you have validated all your data. To get the list of all the validation rules that exist, you can go into the documentation. It's the best place to look for anything you need with more details. And here you can see all the different validation rules that they have. Also, if you want to display the errors on the user, we can also show them the errors. So for example, in our form here at the end, we're just going to display something like errors. There's a PHP, well actually Laravel variable for errors that is shared by all views that will show you all the errors that the form produced. So let's see if this works. Now let's go into our form, let's go back, let's refresh, and here you can see obviously this is very ugly. It doesn't matter, we're just going over the theory and the different options that Laravel has to give you error messages. So here I'm just gonna put in something whatever, and here instead of putting a number I'm gonna put something, and the error should show up in here. Let's see what happens. And here you can see it says contact age. The contact age field must be a number. So then you can use CSS or whatever you want to make this look pretty.